Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of Jewish Studies, University College London, and the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's lecture, which also has collaboration with the American-Israel Numismatic Association. So before we actually begin, I'd just like to say that the spring program of the Institute of Jewish Studies is already in preparation, and we have 3 lectures planned already for January, the 18th of January, 1st of February, and the 23rd of February, and you should be able to get all this information. I think it'll be in the chat, and it'll be on the website, and you'll also get it from Sarah Ben Isaac via email. So without further ado, I'd just like to ask Anthony Rabin from the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society to say a few words. Anthony?
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everybody. The Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society is delighted to be joining what I'm sure will be an absolutely fascinating talk by Professor David Jacobson on Agrippa II. Before Mark introduces David to you all, I just wanted to introduce the Society to those who may be unfamiliar with us, and apologies, of course, to our members watching who will know all of this. The Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society was founded actually 60 years ago this year. It's a non-political charitable organization designed to raise awareness of the rich and fascinating archaeology of Israel and the Middle East. We've got 3 principal activities: hosting archaeology lectures, providing travel grants for students to go on digs in Israel, and publishing a highly regarded peer-reviewed journal, Strata, whose editor-in-chief is your speaker today. We put on 10 to 12 lectures a year, covering all periods from prehistory to early modern times. Currently, of course, on Zoom, but hopefully in 2022, moving to a mixed program of physical lectures put on in central London and virtual ones. This year, we've hosted 12 virtual lectures, topics ranging from Judean women refugees in wilderness caves to the synagogue at Hukkok to a history of archaeology of Megiddo. We don't charge for admission, and recordings of nearly all those lectures can be found on our website. Our second activity, as I've mentioned, our grants program has of course been suspended for 2021, but notwithstanding the current global health situation, it'd be nice to believe that we could recommence in 2022. The program is primarily focused on undergraduates studying in the disciplines of archaeology, biblical studies, theology, or classical studies, and helps them with travel and subsistence costs while on digs in Israel. The third of our activities is the publication of Strata. 2021's issue of Strata is about to be published in the next week or two and contains, as always, a fascinating range of articles on current archaeological topics by world-leading scholars, together with book reviews and summaries of our lectures. We also regularly hold joint events with other institutions and organizations that share our interests, such as, of course, today's lecture, and we arrange museum visits and outings for our members. Our membership is open to all, and we do actively welcome new members. We're a charity and rely on membership fees and generous donations to continue our activities. And as a member, not only do you help fund those very worthwhile activities, but you get a copy of Strata and have access to the lectures and recordings before the general public. And if you're watching and you're not a member, I do urge you to join by getting in contact with our administrator, Sheila Ford, whose email you can obtain from Sarah or from our webpage. The cost, I might add, is very reasonable. So enough of the adverts. Back to Mark to introduce our speaker today, Professor David Jacobson.
Thank you very much, Anthony. David Jacobson is no stranger to the present audience. For many years, he's been associated with the Palestine Exploration Fund and also at the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at University College, as well as his current affiliation now with the Faculty of Oriental Studies of the University of Oxford. This is his first book. He's written about Moresha, he's written about coins. We organized, there was an Institute of Jewish Studies conference in the past about coinage, very interesting. And if you Google David Jacobson, you will find a very interesting book on Google about the Palestine Exploration Fund and its photographic collection with some really wonderful photographs, and I recommend you do that. So I just want to say that we're very pleased to have David this evening talk about his latest book on Agrippa II, the last of the Herods. And because we've always enjoyed this association with David. And I'd just like to say that while he's speaking, you're very welcome to put questions into the chat. And at the end of his talk, then I will take the questions from the chat, address them to David, and we'll have the answers that we're looking for. So without further ado, I would like to give David the chair. Over to you, David.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. Indeed, I want to thank you for initiating this whole event and this initiative. And I want to thank also the Institute of Jewish Studies, which has been a long-time supporter of my endeavors. I also want to thank, of course, the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society, which I'm also very much involved with as Editor-in-Chief of Strata. And I want to thank the third participating organization, the American-Israel Numismatic Association. Without any more ado, I will begin this lecture. Thank you. On this lead-in slide, you can see two coin images. On the right is the young Agrippa II, very tantalizing. You don't see many features there. And in fact, there are no later images of him. This is a coin minted by his father, Agrippa I, who was quite an incisive ruler. And he's called on this coin the Great King, something that he really did deserve. Right, now, Agrippa II was the next slide. Agrippa II was the last of the member of the Herodian dynasty. The dynasty was effectively begun by Herod the Great, although his father had before him had a certain authority in the Hasmonean kingdom, and he was a grand polygamist. He stands out in that regard among all the figures from the Greco-Roman world. He had many wives. He had a favorite, Mariam II. Mariam, she was a Hasmonean princess, and her two sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, were favored as successors. But there was a lot of sibling rivalry, particularly with the eldest son, who was not quite favored, Antipater. And the upshot of it was that they were all murdered, they were all executed by their father in a fit of jealousy, of jealous rage. Now, Aristobulus, who married, by the way, a first cousin, the daughter of a sister of Herod, Salome, his wife was called Berenice, which was very much a popular name in Egypt, Ptolemaic Egypt. They had a number of children, of whom Agrippa and his brother Herod of Chalcis were the two males.
David, can I just interrupt for a second? Please try to speak into the microphone, because it seems to be sometimes it's sort of fading in and out.
Okay, I'll bring it closer. Is that better?
I think that's better, yes.
Okay, I'm awfully sorry.
That's all right.
To have this feedback. Agrippa and his brother Herod of Chalcis were the two favored sons of Aristobulus, who we hear a lot about in history. And Agrippa II was Agrippa I's son. Now, Agrippa the First, who I will say more about, married his first cousin, Cyprus, who was the daughter of the sister of his father Aristobulus. So there's a lot of incest going on, and I think it does have an effect on a certain dullness of character of Agrippa II, which you will learn about later. Of Agrippa II's siblings, he had 3 sisters, 2 of whom are very interesting personalities. One is the famous Berenice, who had that very well-known love affair with Titus. And the other, Drusilla, is also rather interesting because she scandalized the Herodian house. So that's the family structure. As far as the kingdoms are concerned, Agrippa I had a kingdom that was actually larger than that of his grandfather, his famous grandfather Herod, and in a sense it marks the apogee of the Herodian line, of the Herodian dynasty, because he had not only the territories of his grandfather, which included Judea, Samaria, Galilee, the large area, very arid area northeast of the Sea of Galilee, but he had some territory also in present-day Lebanon, which his grandfather didn't have. But like a meteor, he burnt out fairly quickly and died suddenly after only a few years on the throne. His son, by comparison, ended up with a much smaller kingdom, shifted northwards, higher up into the Lebanon, with only little pieces of territory of historical land of Israel, the area around the Sea of Galilee and the southern Perea, bordering on the Jordan and the Dead Sea. So he's not really, therefore, in territorial sense, a king of the Jews. Now, some more flesh I will now add to to his life. He was born in 2728, as I said, to first cousins. At that time, Judea was governed not by a Herodian king, but by a Roman governor, who at that time happened to be Pontius Pilate. In 37 CE, these dates are all CE, Tiberius the emperor died, and he was succeeded by the infamous Caligula. Agrippa I grew up in the Roman court and was educated there. So Caligula and Claudius as well were childhood friends of his. And Caligula favored him and awarded him the former domain of his uncle, the son of Herod who ruled the longest. His kingdom was that arid area northeast of the Sea of Galilee. But he was also given an Etrurian territory of Abilene, which is in present-day Lebanon. In 40 CE, Herod Antipas, that is another son of Herod the Great, was deprived of his tetrarchy in Galilee and Perea by Caligula. It arose, his loss of power arose through his rather ambitious wife Herodias, who demanded of Caligula more territory for her husband, and of course it misfired. It went down like a lead balloon, and Caligula could be rather nasty, as we all know. Anyway, in 41, Caligula is assassinated. Claudius accedes to the throne, and we know that from both Josephus, the Jewish historian, but also from Roman historians, that Agrippa, being a childhood friend of his as well, helped him to the imperial mantle. Dio Cassius is the main Roman source for that. He was close to his brother Herod, Agrippa, and he asked for his brother to be awarded a kingdom as well. So he got Chalkis, which is next to Abilene in Lebanon. And in about the same year, their sister Berenice was married to a very rich Jewish merchant from Alexandria called Marcus Julius Alexander. But he didn't live very long. And in 44, Berenice got married to Agrippa I's brother, in other words, her uncle, Herod of Chalcis. And later that year, in the summer, Agrippa I died suddenly in Caesarea while attending games being held there. And the counselors of the emperor Claudius advised him not to pass Agrippa I's kingdom to his son, Agrippa II. They gave a number of reasons: that he was immature, he was only a youth, but also Judea was becoming a rather difficult province to deal with. And so he had to wait. It's only after Herod of Chalcis died that he received his kingdom. It's a small patch of territory. But with it came a responsibility for the temple in Jerusalem. Herod of Chalcis had the authority to appoint and dismiss high priests, as well as having to look after the fabric and maintain the continuity of the temple rituals. And Agrippa II received those as well. So he had a toehold, as it were, in Jerusalem. And it has some interesting repercussions. In 52-53, the Roman governor of Judea is back in direct Roman, under Roman rule after the death of Agrippa I. That governor, who's a real social climber, whose name is Felix, who boasts to everybody that he wed 3 queens, one of them of which is Drusilla, the youngest daughter of Agrippa I, who he lures from her husband, Azizus of Emesa, client king in Syria. It didn't seem to go down well with Agrippa II because they didn't get on very well together. After that, we don't hear much more about Drusilla. In 53, Claudius exchanges Chalcis with Abilene, which is a neighboring piece of territory, and also gives him that area northwest of the Sea of Galilee that had belonged to Philip the Tetrarch's domain. In 54-55, Agrippa II is now moving upwards in Roman esteem. He further shows his loyalty by contributing an auxiliary force to Roman military campaign against Parthia. It was a putative campaign. It didn't develop into a proper conflict. Claudius dies in 54 and is succeeded by Nero. And Agrippa is then given those 2 pieces of ancestral territory in Western Galilee, in Eastern Galilee, I should say, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and southern Perea, east of the River Jordan. Now, in 58, something rather interesting happens. There's this very interesting encounter between the governor Festus, who you can see here in this painting by Nikolai Bodorevsky, a 19th century artist. What had happened is that the Apostle Paul had been incarcerated by Felix, the previous governor. Felix had been recalled to Rome, but leaving an untidy mess in his affairs, or the affairs of Judea. One of these unresolved issues was the incarceration of Paul. Paul had come back to Jerusalem from one of his missionary journeys and had gained the reputation of disregarding many of the Jewish ordinances. And when he went to the temple with some companions, he caused a furor and was arrested and was incarcerated in Caesarea. Now, when Festus arrives to replace Felix as governor, Agrippa and Berenice, note the two are together, come to Caesarea to welcome the new governor. And the governor says, look, I've got a number of problems that I've been left to deal with, one of which is what to do with Paul. And he says, since you know better about the affairs of Judea, after all, you have responsibilities for the temple, you advise me on what I should do with this man. Has he committed any serious offense? So they have a discussion, and Paul tells Agrippa what his beliefs are, etc. And Agrippa turns to Festus. They have a conference afterwards between themselves and say, this man is actually quite harmless. He's not done anything serious. He should be allowed to go. But Paul, in the meanwhile, has indicated to the governor that as a Roman citizen, he wants the charges that had been laid against him finally settled in Rome. So off to Rome he goes, and we'll know what happens next. But it's a marvelous window of in the affairs of Agrippa and also Berenice. Another event occurs that year, and this is actually quite revealing. It shows that that Agrippa hasn't managed to interact positively with the Jewish establishment, with the priestly establishment in Jerusalem, because he decides to build a penthouse dining room above his palace in Jerusalem. Now, where was his palace, first of all? The palace was not Herod's palace on the west side of Jerusalem, where the present citadel is, which was now occupied by the Roman governor of Judea. He had to be in Jerusalem from time to time to deal with the affairs of the temple, so he needed somewhere to live. So he chose the old Hasmonean palace, overlooking the Temple Mount, or rather facing the Temple Mount across the Tyrophean Valley. Now, clearly the Jews, the Jewish leaders, were unhappy about this monarch, who was not terribly Jewish in his in terms of his own observances, that he's wining and dining and presumably entertaining friends like this and overlooking their temple. But the truth of the matter is that really he couldn't see very much. Here is his palace. It was, we're told by Josephus, it was next to the viaduct leading up to the temple across the valley. It's, for those who know a little bit about Jerusalem and its topography and remains, the principal remain of this viaduct is Wilson's Arch. From the palace, which was next to this viaduct, you couldn't see very much of the temple. First of all, you have a very large structure, the sanctuary, which was 100 cubits high, cubits about half a meter, and in front of it is where all ceremonies occurred around the altar on the far side. So even if he could peer across the western wall of the enclosure, his view would have been blocked by the sanctuary. Anyway, I think it was more the principle of him having this dining room overlooking the temple that rankled. By the way, here is a view that one has today of that topography, with Agrippa's temple roughly here, the temple in its enclosure here, with the sanctuary roughly where the Dome of the Rock now stands, and you could see that you can't really see even across the present Western Wall, which is much lower than it was in antiquity. So, but it shows bad blood between Agrippa and the Jewish elite. And this really continued from this point, their relationship continued to go downhill. So, for example, the Levites came to Agrippa and asked whether they could get his permission as the manager of the temple's affairs, whether they could wear the same garb, same clothing as the Cohens, as the priests, and which was some sort of linen fabric. And he said yes, without consulting them, without consulting the priests. And that brought him into conflict with the Sanhedrin and further added to the bitterness between the Herods and the Jewish elite. About the same year, we talk about the year 60 now, he renamed the old capital of Philip the Tetrarch, which was Caesarea of Philip, as Neronius, to flatter the emperor. In 63, 3 years later, roughly, all the major building work on the temple was finished, and Agrippa wisely diverted the redundant workers to public work, to pave the streets of Jerusalem. In 63, 64, a really nasty character is appointed governor of Judea, Gessius Florus. And this is already, there is a lot of unrest in Judea, and he actually only stirs the pot even more. A spark ignites in Caesarea between the Gentiles and the Jews over entry to a synagogue. And Gessius, of course, sides with the Gentiles. He is very, very antagonistic. In fact, he then turns to the Jews of Jerusalem and demands more taxes. In fact, he demands temple treasure, saying that the population are behind or in arrears with their taxes to Rome.
David, I just want to remind you to move closer to the microphone, okay?
Okay, sorry, am I
Right.
too far?
We're trailing, your voice trails off a little bit. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
Is it better?
No, I don't know. Let me move it right up. So, I'm awfully sorry about that. Anyway, so what happened, what Florus does, is the Jews complain, I'll go back. The Jews complain that this is unfair, that they are not really behind their taxes, and he sets his soldiers against the population in Jerusalem. And Berenice is there at the time, fulfilling Nazirite vows in expiation for probably an illness. The Nazaritic ritual was performed. It's a biblical tradition, it's mentioned in the Bible, where men would grow their hair long, and at the end of it, they would cut their hair. It was a period of self-denial and abstinence. Anyway, she remonstrates. She's in the midst of this, performing this ritual, and in the midst of it, she sees all this violence going on. So she appeals to Florus to stop. What does he do? He rebuts her, and she manages to escape with her life back to the old Hasmonean palace where she's living, where she's staying. And we can see that the whole situation there is deteriorating. Where is Agrippa at this point in time? Agrippa is in Alexandria, celebrating the appointment of one of his friends, a Jewish renegade, member of actually the family of Philo, the philosopher, who had been appointed Roman governor of Egypt, Tiberius Julius Alexander. anyway, he comes back to Jerusalem, and he sees the town seething with discontent, and he decides to address the population, and he warns the people not to embark on a rebellion, saying that if they did so, they would be crushed and the repercussions would be enormous. And he reminds them that many illustrious peoples, like the Macedonians, who had a big empire, and the Egyptians, and even the Britons, who were protected by their sea, have not been able to escape Roman power. Britain was at that time being invaded by and occupied by Rome. But they eventually, after wavering, they the leaders decide to pursue a conflict with Rome. And Agrippa says to them, look, if you don't take my advice, I'm going to wash my hands of you. I will have nothing to do with the Jews anymore. To rub salt into the wound, major cities in his own kingdom participate in the rebellion. Tiberius is at risk of disaffiliating from his authority. And Gamala rebels completely. And he sends a force to retake Gamala, or Gamla, as it's known in Hebrew. And he's rebutted. He's actually hit by a stone in the process. So the rebellion is now in full swing. The Romans tell the governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, to deal with it. He brings up an expeditionary force to Jerusalem, and on the eve of really trying to pursue a proper siege, he decides, well, it's going to be too difficult, and maybe he doesn't have enough men, and he decides to retreat. And of course, that's the worst thing a Roman general could do, because the rebels pursue the retreating Roman army and pick off their men. It's a disaster for Rome. And Nero is then obliged to initiate a far larger campaign, taking his finest general, who's Vespasian. He's busy in Britain at that time, and he sends him to Judea with his son Titus to quash the rebellion. And the war is now a full-scale conflict, full-scale war. Not only are 4 legions involved, but contingents from the different client kings, including part of Agrippa's army. And he is successful. He takes Galilee and he regains Gamala by siege. Agrippa has one small glimmer of glory, is he persuades the elite in Gamala, the patricians who are pro-Herodian anyway, to get control of Tiberius and stop it from rebelling, and it doesn't participate. In fact, that's important for the future, because it means that the 2 major cities in Galilee, Sepphoris and Tiberias, are not participating in the Jewish war, which leads to the establishment of the Jewish center after the war in Galilee rather than in Judea. So there is Gamala. It's a marvelous site to visit. I'm sure some of you have visited it. It's called Gamala because it's got a peak that looks like a camel's hump. It was only rediscovered in the late 1960s. It was unoccupied after its destruction by Vespasian, and so a lot of it is is quite well preserved. Its chief building is its synagogue. It had a very strong Jewish character. Its site is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. You can see the lake here in the distance. And you can also see the point where the Romans broke through the walls. It's very graphic. It provides very graphic evidence of the conflict. There is the synagogue. It's linked to a mikveh ritual pool, and it's very special in being one of the very few synagogue complexes that predates the Jewish war, that predates the fall of the temple. Now, after the war, true to his word, Agrippa disowns the Jews and aligns himself with Roman success. Here is a coin minted in Tiberias, where he's celebrating the victory of the emperor in the inscription on the reverse. Other than that, he includes there are symbols on his coins, motifs, celebrating the victory, the Nike, a winged victory, writing the name of the emperor on a shield with one foot on a helmet, and to show that this is really associated with the Jewish war. This is a coin minted by Vespasian in Rome when he became emperor, celebrating his victory. It said the coin on the reverse says the victory of the emperor, and it shows the winged victory writing on a shield with a foot on a helmet, a palm tree, which is a symbol of Judea, and a mourning Jewess under the palm tree. Now I wish to turn to Berenice, who has a very interesting role in Agrippa's kingdom. She's portrayed as a royal consort. And in fact, when you go through Josephus's account of those events at that time, he refers to their majesties and talks about an administrator of the kingdom appointed by their majesties. A certain Ptolemy is called the overseer of Agrippa and Berenice. The commander of his army, Philip of Jacimus, a son of Jacimus, addresses some correspondence not just to Agrippa, but to their majesties. She, we've seen, accompanies Agrippa to the interview with Paul. She's present beside him when he makes his speech in Jerusalem. And quite separately, there is an inscription dating from after the war, which is dedicated to the Syrian goddess Atargatis. It's a temple to that goddess at a place in far-flung Akka, North Lebanon, a place called Kalat Fakra, which refers to both, which honors both Agrippa and Berenice by name. They share the same residence in Jerusalem, and when she was not married, you find them together. Their cohabitation gave rise to gossip that the siblings had entered into incestuous relationship. So Josephus writes, she was having a liaison with her brother. This is in Antiquities. Juvenal writes about Agrippa's incestuous sister. So there's clearly something going on here. At the same time, she's acting as a queen in her own right while her brother is king. There's an inscription in Athens, which it was the base of a statue honoring her. And it's an inscription where the Council of Athens and the people of Athens honor Berenice, the great queen, the daughter of King Julius Agrippa and the offspring of a great king. In Beirut, Berenice as it was known then, which was patronized by the Herods, particularly because it was refounded as a Roman colony with Roman veterans settling there. The language in Berenice, unlike the rest of the Near East, was not Greek, but Latin. So we have this Latin inscription honoring the great Queen Berenice, daughter of the great King Agrippa. Now, the Athens inscription doesn't mention Agrippa II at all. The one in Berenice, in Beirut, mentions King Agrippa, but that's her father. There may have been mention in the full inscription, because we only have part of it, to her brother. This is an interesting one because it refers to a building that their ancestor, King Herod the Great, had built and which had gone into dilapidation, which they had repaired and renovated. Now, incestuous royal couples are recorded all over the Near East, and this is something to bear in mind. A well-known couple were the Adelphoi, Ptolemy II, and his sister queen, Arsinoe. The Seleucids practiced the same custom. Seleucus IV and his brother, Antiochus IV, married their sister Laodice, not at the same time, of course, they succeeded one another. Demetrius Sota, the son of Seleucus IV, also married his sister Laodice. The coin below is of Demetrius Sota and Laodice. And you can clearly see they are co-rulers, king and queen. An interesting example is provided by Pontus. That's a kingdom bordering the north coast of Asia Minor, facing the Black Sea, where King Mithridates IV shares the throne with his sister Laodice Philadelphos, which means the word in Greek, Philadelphos, means brother lover. And Mithridates VI Eupator, one of the great foes of ascendant Rome, also wedded his sister Laodice. Now, what's interesting about this coin is as follows. Incest was generally frowned on in Greek and Roman culture. In an attempt to make brother-sister marriage more palatable to Greeks, the apologists of Ptolemy II pointed out that Zeus and Hera, that's two of the chief gods of the Greek pantheon, of the classical pantheon, were also brother and sister. So making this very point, this coin, this tetradrachma coin, which shows Mithridates and Laodice, shows Zeus and Hera and names both of them as king and queen. In the time of Agrippa I and II, you have Antiochus IV Epiphanes of Commagene. Commagene is a kingdom in East Central Asia Minor, where Antiochus IV, the king, married the Philadelphos, the brother lover, it says it on the coin, Jotope. So the question is, were they simply following a custom that had started in Egypt and then revived by the Ptolemies? It also was practiced in Persia. We know that Cambyses, the son of the great Cyrus, married his sisters. But it's a very common custom. Maybe they were trying to preserve or protect royal blood. I don't know. But certainly the Jews would never have approved this. And it must have caused some more than consternation among them. One thing, of course, about Berenice that's certainly evident is that she had been queen when she was married to Herod of Chalcis. She wanted to hang on to that title, her status. She had 2 sons, by the way, with Herod of Chalcis, so she was normal that way. She continued to latch herself to kingdoms, to that of Agrippa II, but also to King Ptolemy of Pontus, who she married in the 60s briefly. The inscriptions from Athens describing her as a great sovereign seem to bear this out. She was a wealthy queen. After each husband died, she inherited a lot of money, and Roman writers comment on this fact. And presumably she had hoped for similar prospects with Titus, which unfortunately never came to pass, as we will see. Anyhow, to finish the chronology, Vespasian finishes most of the war, but Nero dies in 68. There is a scramble for his succession. It's the year of the 4 emperors, ending with Vespasian installed as emperor in Rome. And by the way, Berenice financed his campaign, Vespasian's campaign to become emperor. Titus completed the siege of Jerusalem in 70 after this lull, and the temple was destroyed, and Jerusalem finally fell with the fall of the upper city in September 70. Vespasian and Titus go back to Rome, celebrate a triumph in the summer of 71. The war ends with the fall of Masada in 73-74, but it's only in 75, it seems, that Agrippa and Berenice come to Rome. Berenice moves into the royal palace with Titus. Agrippa is given a minor honor. He's made a praetor of the Roman state for his services in the war, but evidently not much new territory goes to him. But there's this interesting correspondence between Agrippa and Josephus. Josephus sends him a copy of his account of the war, and Agrippa proves and says it's very reliable and accurate. So they knew one another. But now I need to tell you something further about the source material when I was working on this biography. Up to the war, there's a lot of literary evidence, particularly from Josephus. Josephus was a direct contemporary of Agrippa. After the war, there's hardly any literary evidence for Agrippa. What we have is, but we do have other evidence. We have lots of coins and we have inscriptions. And here I want to thank a good friend and colleague, David Graff, Professor David Graff of Miami, a leading historian of the southern Levant and an expert on the Nabateans, who has collated and compiled all the known inscriptions associated with Agrippa, and has produced a marvelous appendix in my biography. I can't thank him enough for it. It's a very great feature of the book, I feel. I've also examined the coins. There is another appendix on the coins. Again, the coins come into their own after the war. So in a way, the coins and the inscriptions after the war beautifully complement the texts that we have from the classical sources before the war. But we have a problem. We know that, of course, Vespasian dies in 79. Titus comes to the Roman throne, and he then promptly dismisses Berenice because Berenice is seen as an impediment in Rome. They don't like foreign queens. We don't hear any more about Berenice. We don't know whether she practiced Judaism. We don't know anything. We don't know when she died. And we don't know really when, well, we didn't know when Agrippa died. I looked at all the evidence. There were different dates given, but nothing based on direct contemporary evidence. So I decided to check whether it was possible to work out the date of his death from his coinage. And I was able to. This was a great piece of luck I had. And I was able to establish that he died, or at least stopped being king, in 94-95 CE, which was a year before the end of the Flavian dynasty. The dynasty started by Vespasian with the death of Domitian in 76. So this brings me to the very final part of my talk, which is the date of the death of Agrippa II. We have two eras for Agrippa. This is an added complication. We have termed year X of Agrippa. In this case, in two coins minted before the Jewish War, we have two coins giving these two eras as year 6, which is also year 11 of what? What starts the era? We don't know. There's the other coin, year 6, which is also year 11, or year 11, which is also year 6. Actually, the larger number usually comes first. Here is a table with the two coins represented, year 11, also year 6. And then we have the two eras represented on 3 inscriptions. These inscriptions are, whereas the coins are before the war, the inscriptions are after the war. Year 10, which is also year 15. This is the other way around. It depends on a reading of a very difficult inscription. And then another inscription, another one where we have year 21, which is also year 16, and year 37, which is also year 32. So these eras were consistent eras. There's a 5-year difference between them. Well, I won't bore you with the whole manner in which one has to work all this out, but we have a fixed point. We have a hook on this. By good fortune, there are coins that were minted in Rome which were also adapted for use in Judea. The same designs. The only difference is that the name of Agrippa and the year of Agrippa are added to the rest of the inscriptions. They are from, and we know their Roman dates, or rather their dates in terms of the reign of Domitian, who figures on these coins, as 84 and 86. This one happens to be 85, but the ones that were reissued that circulated in Judea were 84 and 86, which correspond to years 25 and 26 of Agrippa. And that tells us that one of the eras was 60-61 CE. That the only event that seems to correlate close to that is the refounding of Caesarea Philippi as Neronians. It's so we've got this hook, we've got this era established. So the other era must be 55, 56. Presumably that is the year that Agrippa had gained possession of Tiberias, the capital of Galilee. It is known that era started with the either the possession of new territory or the foundation of new cities, because Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra, when she got possession of Victorian territory, she declared a new era. And you see this on Etrurian coins. Now, it doesn't solve everything. There are some anachronisms. There are coins which don't fit because they show reigning emperors when they should be dead, according to the era counting. But it's the best solution that we have. However, to really test this idea that we have an era of 60-61, which incidentally is the principal era of Agrippa. So where one era only is mentioned, it's going to always be the year 60-61 as the start of it. So what I did was I looked for the last coins issued according to the sequence of years of Agrippa. And the last one is year 35 of Agrippa, which is this is an example of that. And that would correspond to the year 94-95. But that's not enough to determine the end of his reign. I had to do something else. Now, it was usual for towns in the east of the empire, many of them, to issue their own autonomous coinage when they were not under a sovereign of some sort. And sure enough, I found one. I found one in the Hauran, in that territory northeast of the Sea of Galilee, at a place called Canatha, a very old Hellenistic foundation. And it produced a coin in the era, it's a different era that city used. It looked back to the year 62 BCE when Pompey came out on his eastern campaign and conquered the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, the Seleucid kingdom, and restructured it all. And many cities in the east dated their eras and continue to do so through antiquity to the Pompeian era. And the Pompeian year on this particular coin is 157, which corresponds to 95 CE. Now, this is interesting because Canatha had produced coins in the past, 45 years previously. In other words, before the reign of Agrippa II. So for me, this was a clincher, that you can see the transition from one authority to another in the years 94, 95 CE. And it fits. It's consistent with Josephus. I think I've spoken long enough, so I'm not going through the arguments here. You can find it clearly set out in the book. And all I will say is that it's consistent with Josephus. That's his account. And it seems to fit very well. There's only the one remaining question, and this is what I will, as I come to the end of my lecture, point out that maybe it was the end of his reign, but not of his life. There were kings like Archelaus, the first of the sons of Herod to have a state, who was banished to Gaul in 6 CE, Herod Antipas, who followed him later in 39 CE, and other rulers. Antiochus IV the Commagene, for example, was deposed in 72 CE and enjoyed an honorable retirement in Rome afterwards. But my view is that if that had happened with Agrippa, that he lost his throne before he died, surely some historian would have mentioned it, because they mention it for all these other monarchs. Anyway, I'll end the lecture with one general comment about Agrippa, that he is a rather lackluster ruler. His accomplishments are minute. He's actually a disappointment. He happened to be on the scene at a most critical moment in history when he might have prevented the war, he might have saved the temple. He does none of that. What we have instead is memory of his famous or infamous sister Berenice, but not of him. And maybe that explains why I'm the first person to write a full biography of this king. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So what's interesting for us, of course, is not Agrippa's personality, as you point out, which seems a little bit disappointing, but the way you've used so many interesting sources, epigraphic sources and historical sources, Josephus and the Acts and the coins, of course. And you've really woven a really very interesting journey for us to follow in how you draw all of these sources together into a really very convincing picture. And the chat shows us that we have a great many questions that have been raised about this. Some of the themes that you mentioned, like brother-sister marriage, and the role of these queens and how influential they were, and other issues that you made. But I've just like one issue that sticks out for me in the chat was raised by Tessa Rajak. I wonder if we could unmute her, if Sarika or Vicky can unmute her, because I'd like Tessa to raise this question about the sources, about the fact that we're really dependent upon the Josephus reporting what Agrippa says or what's happening, and how reliable I would like to know whether Tessa thinks this material is reliable or not. Tessa, can you respond to some of these issues?
Yes. Hello. Well, I don't want to at all. I mean, I think David should have the chance to respond first.
But you raised the question,
I was simply,
so yes.
Particularly the question. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. I mean, particularly the question came up in the chat in an interesting way from one or two people about Agrippa's speech, and that I think David de Vere made the point that it was articulating Josephus's arguments in the Bellum or some of it. So really the broader point is simply that the speech is Josephus's and not Agrippa's, and the following historiographical convention of the period, it wouldn't claim to be the ipsissima verba of Agrippa. So we have to, I think, step back a little bit from that, though I tend to think that probably Josephus, in his aspirations to follow Thucydides, would like to feel that he gave a lot of it as it might have been, or the gist of the thing, but we really don't know. And second, then the question of Paul came up in Acts, and a fortiori Acts doesn't even pretend to be history in the real sense. So there one doesn't know at all about the portrayal. It's a very polemical work. So that's it, but it's for David really to comment on his uses, and I'll be fascinated.
That was the idea.
Well,
that's what I think, David. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me answer these points. They are valid concerns, and I accept the fact that I never claimed for a moment, and you'll see this in the book, that Josephus, that Agrippa's speech, as we have it reported, was actually in the, word for word what Agrippa said. There's no doubt that Josephus refashioned a lot of stuff, but we have to look at the gist. Now, I think there's a certain degree of what should I say? I don't want to be unkind, but of having one's cake and eating it when it comes to assessment of historical sources. That a lot of historians, it's now fashionable to query the reliability of Josephus, but yet that's what we've got, and that's what everybody uses, including those historians who are critical of Josephus. That's what we've got. Now, I've tried to look more closely at that speech since I wrote the book. Well, actually, while I was writing, and I found a number of interesting things. First of all, this sort of detailed knowledge of the Roman political structure, the Roman administration and army, it does suggest that a lot of the basic information did come from Agrippa. Not only that, it is striking that in that speech, 4 or 5 times, that the speech refers to Tyche, good fortune. And it's rather interesting that on Agrippa's coins, Tyche is a very popular motif. You find it time and time again on those coins. No other speech in Josephus refers to Tyche like that. So there are intimations that, yes, it's a rehash of what Agrippa said. I don't deny that. But I think the gist of it does make sense. And the fact that he does indeed wash his hands of the Jews after the rebellion surely is consistent with Agrippa saying that in his speech. Josephus doesn't wash his hands of the Jews afterwards. He writes about them all the time. But Agrippa never, ever refers to them. He doesn't refer to them in his discussion with Josephus, nothing. There's no reference to any Jewish subject matter on any of his later coins.
So a number of people have raised questions also about sources and how you evaluate the sources. So Anthony Shepard, for instance, is interested in Josephus's portrayal of Agrippa II in his Jewish wars and then in the Antiquities and even in the Vitae. Do you find
that's interesting. Yes, he does seem to change his views of Agrippa. There are some nuances and even inconsistencies in Josephus. He's more critical of Agrippa in Antiquities. The statement about him cohabiting with his sister and so on, and that is only in Antiquities, not in the War, which is the book that Agrippa approved of. It's true. But I'm a trained scientist. I've acquired my historical credentials through my later studies. But as a scientist, what you do is you look at the evidence you've got, and the first thing you do, the first aim in looking at such material at your disposal is there an overall consistency? Yes, there's inconsistency in detail, but the overall story makes sense. So I look at this bigger picture in the first instance, and what I see is consistent. Josephus gives by far the best account of the Jewish war. Tacitus is regarded as a good historian. He's awful when it comes to the Jewish war. Josephus, yes, he runs down the rebels, he disparages them, he suggests that they're all disunited, whereas their coinage shows actually they were not so disunited. But still, the sequence of events is largely correct. The temple was destroyed, that even Josephus makes some allowance for the fact that the Romans allowed the temple to be destroyed, even if Josephus doesn't say that Titus ordered it to be destroyed. We also know that the upper city fell after the temple. That's now archaeologically validated. I come back to this. It's the larger picture that has to make sense.
So David DeVore is interested in your use of Acts as an historical source, and this worries him about.
Well, I'm using it as a historical source because there are elements of it which do make sense. Why should the Acts mention that Berenice accompanies Agrippa? Why should Acts mention that Agrippa comes to greet Festus? That's the sort of thing you'd expect of somebody like Agrippa to do. As far as the details of Paul is concerned, I can't answer that. Nobody can. But what I can say is that his general attitude to what Paul says to him and his rather sarcastic response to Paul, saying, I think he's trying to turn me into a Christian, is so human. And it's run so much against actually the general tenor of the New Testament. I think there's a kernel of truth there, even if it isn't as reported verbatim what happened and what was said. And also Martin Goodman has made the very good comment that the Acts does say that after interviewing Paul, that Agrippa, that Festus had a conference meeting with Agrippa to decide on what to do with Paul. And Martin Goodman points out that was a normal sort of thing that happened in such situations.
Right. So one more source, which is not, you haven't mentioned, worries Graham Morris. And that is, what about rabbinic texts? Rabbinic
texts, I've looked into this as well. It's treated in my book. The problem with the rabbinic texts is that they're not specific about Agrippa. We don't know which Agrippa they're talking about. Also, I tend to be less inclined to accept rabbinic texts dealing with historical matters, if only because, well, first of all, like with Christian sources, you have to be careful because there is a theological orientation. But the other point is that they're so much later. So much later. At least Acts is much closer to the period.
And David also asked about Eusebius. Can we use Eusebius as a retrospective source? Would that be? Does that
I haven't used
anything?
I haven't used Eusebius in my analysis.
Right. So let's just go.
I've read him, but I haven't used him.
All right. Let's just go back to the one other issue that's mentioned, that was raised, an important issue that was raised in your text, and this is brother-sister marriage, because several people have commented about this, because we know that these royal marriages, sometimes they can be cousins. It's not so unusual to have these interfamilial marriages. Now, what is your take on this? Do you take it absolutely literally that these are brother-sister marriages in all of the instances that you mentioned?
Yes, it follows a pattern, doesn't it? And it seems as though one writer I read, I can't remember, I haven't got reference to it in front of me, but there were, as you know, the Greeks had a whole philosophy of kingship, what kings should do, what they and what's important for monarchies and so on. And it does seem that consanguinity, keep maintaining blood, the same royal blood within the family, had some importance in those societies. And that might have to do with this issue of this practice, with this practice of brother-sister relationships.
Well, David, I think we've covered all of the main themes that people have raised in the chat, even though there are lots of little details about the end of the war against Rome, etc. There are lots of interesting details that people can look at, and you can look through later on in the chat. And of course, this event will be recorded, so people will have a chance to go back over the material again. But you've covered a lot of interesting ground, and the material that you brought from the coins really shows us why you received this Shekel Award from the Numismatic Society, because it's really very interesting, important new information that you're able to bring to the subject. And the way you've used the sources is also very creative, going this material which has been known for such a long time, but your new reading of it is really very helpful and gives us better understanding of it. And we're all very grateful for this work that you've done, and we're very pleased that you've been able to launch this book this evening with us. So I think you all deserve thanks from the many people here this evening who've been listening to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yes. Thank you everyone for joining us.